All right, well, thank you, Mac. My name is Mike McCoy, and this is the Bradenton Kiwanis Club. To welcome everybody to our weekly Zoom meeting. Looking forward to getting back to our regular lunch meetings, but not sure when that'll be. I would like to introduce Andy Miner, who will provide the invocation. Andy?
Pray with me, please. Dear Lord Jesus, I just want to thank you for this Kiwanis Club and thank you for all the families that represents in Manatee County. Keep us safe as we go through this coronavirus period and to keep our leaders wise in how we should handle it. And always remember the purpose of the Kiwanis is the children of this community and to focus on them. Precious name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Andy. Mac, we do have some announcements. Did you want to do those?
I'm going to just introduce a couple of guests, and then Andrea Del Santo had one for sure. Want to recognize Mr. Telfair, Charles Telfair. He was invited by Judge Smith, and we have Judge Smith's wife, Anita, so want to thank them for being here. And I'm going to let you, or I guess Gilbert's going to introduce our guest speaker in a little bit. Let me see if there's anybody else who showed up here in the meantime. No. Okay, so let me find Andrea again. Andrea, you want to unmute yourself and tell us what you got going on, please?
Yes, thank you so much, Mac. I just wanted to let everybody know that Big Brothers Big Sisters is still making matches during this difficult time. We are doing virtual matches, which may be easier for a lot of people, kind of like we were saying earlier. And we do have a lot of kids that need mentors right now, especially with the schools being closed since March. A lot of our kids are falling behind. If you are interested in being matched virtually, we have a information webinar coming up on July 7th. There are 2 information sessions. One's at 10:30 in the morning and one is at 5:30. And Mac is going to send out the flyer with the newsletter this next week, so it will have all the information, but you can also contact me directly. I'll, after I close out of this, I'll put my contact information in the notes for the Zoom meeting. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Andrea. I don't know of anybody else. Mike, I know of any other announcements?
No, other than just to repeat to see or contact Janine if you have an interest in volunteering with the Hope for Community event or events that are planned for later this summer. And I would like now to introduce Judge Gilbert Smith for a page out of Kiwanis history.
When I left off in 1926, a lot of activity was going on in the town of Bradenton. 2 luxury hotels were built, the Dixie Grand Hotel and the Manatee River Hotel. In fact, when our speaker came down a couple of years ago and spoke to the Manatee County Bar Luncheon, she stayed at the Hampton Inn, which was the renovated Manatee River Hotel. Several members of this club owned minority interest in these establishments, these 2 luxury hotels. Both buildings were 8 stories tall and competed with any luxury hotel in the era. Each hotel had large dining rooms that would accommodate the club's luncheons and the ladies' night, the events that this club had, as well as the installation dinners. The club began using the Dixie Grand Hotel at this time, but for several years they also used the Manatee River Hotel for its luncheon meetings and evening events. And I might add, they used to have a outdoor dining hall and events on the roof of that hotel, and a lot of celebrities from around the nation appeared there, including some famous baseball players. On December 14th, 1926, at the regular luncheon meeting, the club elected Dewey A. Dye as the 1927 president, along with Hiram Shelton Moody as vice president, Elon Root as secretary, William A. Manning as district trustee, and R.M. Bell, Robert Bentley, A.H. Chapman, Whitney Curry, Dr. Samuel Hollingsworth, Harry Land, and Henry K. Talent as directors. On December 21st, 1926, at the regular luncheon meeting at the Dixie Grand Hotel, Dewey Dye was sworn in as the 1927 president, along with the other elected officers and directors. Mrs. Marion Curry Green, wife of E.P. Green, Jr., who had been named Miss Bradenton, was the honored guest who represented the club in the recent pageant. She was given a standing ovation by the club members. Now, when Dewey became president of the club, he was also serving as president of the Manatee County Bar Association and had earned considerable influence in the community. And I'm glad Charlie Telfair is here to hear that, because we had such an influential member as president of this club, but at the same time, the Bar Association. Dewey was born December 8th, 1898 in Leon, Iowa, to Homer and Marisa Louisa Gassett Dye. He was raised in Missouri, but Horace's family moved to Bradenton while he was in elementary school. He attended Bradentown High School and was a star football player for the Hurricanes, where he graduated in 1914. He went on to play guard and center for the Gators at the University of Florida. At 5'11" and 190 pounds, Dewey was a star on the defense and was known to smash his opponents on the line with his unrelenting charges on every play. He also took on the name Colonel and was also the editor of the school newspaper, The Alligator. He graduated from University of Florida with an AB in 1918 and began law school. During summer breaks, Dewey clerked with attorney Charles T. Curry in Bradentown, who at that time was practicing law in the Fuller Building. And many of you don't know, but the Fuller Building's on the northwest corner of Manatee Avenue and Main Street. That's the stone building where the dye firm, the Harrison and Dye firm, is at this time. Upon graduating with an LLB in May of 1920, he first started practicing law with a firm in Tampa before moving back to Bradentown to work for Mr. Curry. Tragically, after Dewey began work in 1921, Mr. Curry died and Dewey took over his practice. He and another young attorney, J. Henry Taylor, practiced together for several years. During this time, Dewey also served as state attorney of the 18th Judicial Circuit, which covered Manatee County in successive circuits from 1920 until 1930. He also served as the Manatee County attorney in 1923. As president of the club and the Manatee County Bar Association, he led both organizations with hard work and used his position in both organizations to increase his influence in the community. He practiced law in the office of the Fuller Building for over 40 years before his firm moved to the modern building constructed by Manatee National Bank, which was on the corner of 9th Street and Manatee Avenue. Now I'm going to stop at this point, but we're going to hear more about Dewey Dye next week. For the rest of his life, he was an influential member of this club as well as the Bar Association, and we're going to hear more about him, a lot more, and in the next few chapters.
Well, thank you, Gilbert. I just love hearing that the history of this club, and to recognize those names, and to know that Steve Dye is his grandson is still a member today, which is really cool. I would now like to, am I introducing you to introduce our guest, or is that Christy?
No, I'm going to introduce
All
our
right,
speaker.
I'm going to introduce you again so you can introduce our guest.
Okay. Well, let me first say that I'm just so happy that my wife's able to join us because we have become good friends with our speaker, and we really want to have her back in person and when things get a little bit back normal, so that we can see her and she can share some more work that she's been doing. And I'm also going to tell you some other fun things she does. This is Professor Mary Adkins, teaches legal writing and appellate advocacy at the University of Florida, Levin College of Law. Not only does law school teach future lawyers how to think like lawyers, but also how to write like lawyers. She's a triple graduate of the University of Florida, earning her bachelor's, master's, and Juris Doctorate degree there. And now, let me tell you some interesting facts about our speaker. Before she went to law school, she had a career with a sailboard company and worked all over the world and became a windsurfing champion. Maybe she can teach some of us some of that someday. She was the district director of the Muscular Dystrophy Association in Southwest Florida, covering 10 counties from Collier to Manatee and inland, including DeSoto County. And she coordinated clinics, ran summer camps, fundraised. Sounds like a lot of things that we do. And Mary was here some time ago, but there may have been some members of our club that got to know Mary at that time. Now, after law school, she practiced law for many years with different law firms, and she did practice law with the law firm of Holland and Knight. She has an expertise in Florida Constitution, the history of it, and also the Constitutional Revision Commissions. She's written a book, and for those of us, I saw that Cliff Walters was on this Zoom, Charles Telfair, and I don't know if there was any other lawyers that are here, but we had Mary here to talk to us just last year about the, a couple of years ago, about the Florida Constitutional Revision Commission. And she has done a lot of work on that and continues to do that. But one last fun fact is that she and her husband, Mitchell, are expert gardeners and just harvested tomatoes from her 198 heirloom tomato plants. And she said that if she was here in person, she would have brought us all some tomato sauce. So that's a good reason to ask her back. So if she's going to talk to us about being inspired to write books and a little bit of the work that she does at the University of Florida. Mary.
Thank you, Gilbert. And I wish I could be there in person. Anita, it's great to see you again as well, wherever you went on the screen. There you are. I first need to give you a little caution, and I'm sure it's a caution that you all have experienced. I am alone in the house today with my 2 dogs, and I cannot make them not bark. I can try. Usually they're sort of lulled to sleep by the sound of my voice when I'm yakking on Zoom meetings, so we ought to be all right, but I just wanted to give you a little warning there. I'm between books now, so that might be why Gilbert asked me to talk about kind of how I got inspired to do it, what it's like, what you might experience if you decide to write a book. And I wanted to kind of put it into, and by the way, I'm not a windsurfing champion. I do have trophies, but they give them out a lot. You know, I came in second in the B class type thing. So anyway, I wanted to divide it roughly into kind of inspiration to write books at all, and then inspiration, why I kind of wrote the ones I wrote. Like many people, I grew up liking to read, loving to write, feeling like, you know, being told by your 9th grade English teacher that you're good at it, that kind of thing. I always wanted to be a book writer, but obviously that was completely unrealistic as a way to support myself, and so I never pursued it. I did major. I went to the journalism school. You know, writing plus maybe you can actually get a job was what was in my mind. I had a public relations major, which took me to that very interesting job marketing windsurfers all over the place and running regattas. That was really kind of a fun job, which put me into then the muscular dystrophy, writing, you know, all kinds of the little things that you write as a professional doing one thing or another. I reached a turning point in my life after that, and I had a chance to reassess what it was I really liked, what I thought I was good at, what I really wanted to do, and it led me to apply to law school. I wanted to be in a helping profession. I didn't enter law school to try to change the world, and I didn't enter law school to try to get rich. I entered law school because I thought it would play to what I knew were my strengths, which was reading and writing. And so I ended up going to law school. I did make law review. That was a nice little thump up in my career. And got a job at a big law firm, Holland and Knight, where, of course, you know, it was a great law firm full of consummate professionals. I really liked it. But, you know, you the stuff you're writing as a lawyer is, motions and memoranda. Maybe you're drafting a proposed order. It's not, the kind of writing that if you grow up as a little kid wanting to be a writer, that's not the kind of thing you're thinking about. So I eventually, through a couple of turns of fate, ended up teaching legal writing at U of F. And one thing about teaching, it's a busy job, but it's nothing like practicing law, where every hour of every day you're thinking about how many hours you're going to bill. And the more you bill, the more money you're going to make. And the more you bill, the more the partners will be happy with you and the clients will be happy with you and, blah, blah, blah. So when I went to teaching, it felt in a particular way like a mental vacation. Not that it wasn't hard, because actually teaching a few dozen brand new law students is challenging, because they're all smart. They don't know anything about law, but they're all smart. And so someone would have a question I couldn't answer. And so I had to be on my toes intellectually. But as far as like having my mind gummed up with the doings of 100 clients or whatever, that was gone. And so I had the kind of mental space, if you want to call it that, to be able to turn my head to, okay, maybe I, could write an article. Or I realized at that point that I really wasn't a novelist. I don't have enough imagination. I can't think of a plot to anything. I tried once. It doesn't. So, but you get curious about things and you've got the time to research them. And so I did. And so I wrote an article or two. And that was sort of how I got my feet on the ground writing. And I had always thought the thing I really want to be is either a novel or a writer or a book editor, right? So never pursued it. So then here I am in academia. Huge pay cut, by the way, but it was worth it in every other way, to kind of have the freedom to think up hypotheticals for my students to research and write about. And then also to indulge my mental curiosity. So that leads us to part two, how I came to write the books that I wrote. I only have one published, but I have two more on the way within the next year. My book that came out in 2016, and those of you who I've met before, we've met because I was in Bradenton talking about this book. It was on the history of the Florida Constitution, how we got our 1968 Constitution, which sounds like it could be a real sleeper. But in fact, as I came to find out, it was a really interesting story. So how I came to write about that was I just sort of got curious about how Florida's politics had changed, because I knew growing up, and I grew up in Brevard County. I was a Space Coast kid. I knew growing up that everyone seemed to be a Democrat, and then by the time I was, well into adulthood and paying attention, that had definitely changed. So I read a few books. I read a couple of academic books by a guy named David Colburn, who wrote about kind of mid-century Florida politics. And then I read, I think Buddy McKay about 10 years ago came out with his book called How Florida Happened. It was sort of his story. And in all these books, I noticed that everybody just sort of mentioned in passing that Florida had gotten a new constitution in 1968. And then they would move right on with their story. And I thought, well, that seems kind of interesting, but I wonder how come nobody mentions it. So I started, this is not the most academic thing to admit to, but I started just kind of Googling around and found a whole bunch of, I found out that there had been a thing called the Constitution Revision Commission in the mid-1960s. And I also heard that there was this group called the Pork Chop Gang that was in charge of, the government in the 50s and 60s. And so, you know, Constitution Revision Commission, what's that? So I look it up and I found that there were a whole bunch of oral history interviews done of the people who had been part of this thing. It was actually their 20th anniversary reunion where UF's oral history program came in and interviewed everybody. So that was really interesting, and they had fascinating recollections. And I thought, okay, well, this story, it exists. You know, research has been done, but the story's never been put together and told. So maybe I could do that, and maybe I'll write a, you know, law review article or something. And it quickly got much bigger than that. The next thing that happened was that I realized, okay, this happened in the mid 60s. Right now it's 2010, 2011. If these people were sort of in their political power years in the 60s, they're getting pretty old now. So I'd better hunt them down and see who's still alive. So I did. And there were about half a dozen that were still around and kicking, and let me interview them. And of course, we're happy to talk about something that no one had asked them about for the last 45 years. So I got some of their memories. And of course, memory, as we all know, is pretty unreliable. And I was already seeing in some of the interviews that people were remembering things differently from each other. So, you know, I did some more research and found out that if I went to the Florida State Archives in Tallahassee, I would find treasure troves of documented information, and I did. So it was, great fun to put it all together, and the interviews were the best. Gosh, they were just the best. I got to interview not only people who were involved, but people who were around them at the time. So I spoke with former governors Graham and Askew, Ralph Turlington. I don't know if that's a name any of y'all remember, but he was on the commission, and then immediately was Speaker of the House and eventually became Education Commissioner. A bunch of these folks that were just so happy to tell me their stories. So that was fascinating. And then I find myself writing something that's clearly long enough to be a book, and I'd never done it before. And I just, one of the people whose books I'd read that were really interesting, and y'all should read them too if you haven't, is Martin Dykman, who wrote, he wrote a biography of former Governor Leroy Collins. He wrote a book called A Most Disorderly Court about the corrupted mess that our state Supreme Court was in the 70s. And he also wrote a book called Reuben Askew and the Golden Age of Florida Politics. So he had written all these books. And I knew that he was coming to a Florida bar meeting. And so I just, I wrote to him and asked him if he would have lunch with me to tell me about how to organize a book. And of course I was starstruck. This guy's written books. And he immediately said, oh yeah, I'm sure I will. So he talked to me, he helped me talk through, you know, who you want to get as a publisher and that kind of thing. His exact words were, I can tell you a publisher who is good to work with if you don't care about money. And that ends up being who published me, and that's University Press of Florida. Anyway, so that was really kind of fun to learn how to put the whole thing together and to learn how to research. And in fact, the whole reason that I have a master's degree in history, I didn't get it until 2017, is because here I am doing this sort of academic endeavor. I realized it was a legal history. I realized that I know how to do legal research, but I wasn't so sure I was doing historical research correctly. So I decided to get a PhD, and then I decided that a PhD would take me the rest of my natural life. So I turned it into an MA and learned historical research methods, which I was relieved to find out I was already doing it right. But they gave me a lot of good insights on just perspective. You know, this is a story about Florida in a particular time, but what were the other southern states doing at that particular time? And how did this compare to what Florida had done before then and after then? So that was all, getting the MA in history really, I think, made it a much better book. So, so I learned about the whole publishing. I don't know if y'all want to hear about that part, but what it's like to publish a book. They said, it's a great book. The introduction you wrote is awful. Please get rid of it and write a different one. And so I did. They gave me a very experienced and hands-on editor who also, although it was painful, he helped it become a much better book too. Gave me some tips about just storytelling. You know, don't introduce a character in chapter 2 and tell everyone what he's going to become. Let them find out, you know, bit by bit what this person's going to become. So things like that. That was really good. So it made it possible to tell a nonfiction, you know, piece of political history in a way that was more interesting. This editor helped me learn how to make it more interesting. So a few rounds of editing, and then they give you the galley proofs, and you have to fly spec those. And then they tell you that you're responsible for doing an index, and if you would, and they said, and we recommend you just hire a professional indexer. It'll cost you about $1,000. Well, because I was a new author, my royalties were at 2% of a $30 book. So needless to say, $1,000, I still haven't made $1,000 on this book. So I found out that there's indexing software and it's affordable. So I bought some indexing software, did my index, and then the total thrill of the day came a month before my publication date. A box arrived in the mail of my books, and there's no feeling like that. That was really something. And so I don't have any children, but I've heard a lot of my friends who have children say, you know, you give birth and that giving birth stuff is awful, and maybe pregnancy is awful too, but after the kid is born and life is wonderful, you go, I think I'll have another kid. Well, that's kind of what I did with the books. It was such a thrill, and I really did enjoy most of the process. And so I started again. And I've actually mostly written 2.5 more books at this point, but one of them is on hold. So my book that's coming out next is coming out this October. It's a biography of the lawyer Chesterfield Smith, who grew up in DeSoto County. He's an Arcadia boy. Did most of his career in Bartow, built the large firm Holland and Knight. He reformed the practice of law, not only in Florida, but around the country. He was a very, and he's also Judge Smith's uncle, which is how I got to know Judge Smith and Anita. And this is worth a little digression. A couple of months after the book came out, I got an email from a person I didn't know named Gilbert Smith Jr. And he said, I read your book. And Chesterfield Smith, by the way, had a lead. He was sort of the star of my first book because he headed up this Constitution Revision Commission, although he died before I was able to interview him for it. And so this person named Gilbert Smith Jr. says, you know, I thought you got the book just right. My uncle Chesterfield was in it. I thought you did a good job with him. And, you know, why don't you come down and talk to one of the groups in Manatee County? So I did. And then shortly after that, Judge Smith, Chet Smith also emailed me, and that's Chesterfield Smith's son, and said, you know, you did a good job. And that meant a lot to me, because when you're writing about people, you know, you didn't know them and now they're gone, but other people knew them. It's nice to hear that you got it right. So so that was kind of neat, and that's really what led to me being friends with Gilbert and Anita, and I value that a lot. In fact, they were a key reason. They basically talked me into writing the biography of Chesterfield Smith. A biography is a tough thing for exactly the reason I just said. People knew this person, especially if it's a biography of someone who, you know, whose life overlapped with ours. And a lot of people knew Chesterfield Smith. He was one of these completely gregarious people. Hundreds of people considered themselves his mentees. They knew him. I only met him twice when I worked at Holland and Knight. Getting it right, getting something like that right is difficult, and it means a lot, and we'll find out. I don't know yet if I got him right. I guess I'll find out in a few months. So let's see. So what ends up happening is you write one thing, and if it's different enough, and no one had written about the particular thing I wrote about with the Constitution, then people start asking you to do related things. And so the latest, or I guess the March issue of the Florida Forum magazine had an article by me on Florida's constitutions. And I'm co-authoring a case book. For those of you lawyers, that very word will give you a headache, but a case book on Florida constitutional law. I helped former Florida Justice James Perry write his autobiography, but the ball is in his court on that. So that's one that's nearly finished, but out of my hands at the moment. So the whole book thing is fun. It's not fun at every moment. And here's my theory on that, and then I'll shut up and let you all ask me questions. Here's my theory about writing nonfiction books. It goes from the most fun stage to the least fun stage, and then immediately comes out in the big thrill. So your research, you interview people, you know, if you like going through dusty files in an archive, that's fun too. The research to me is the most fun. And then the writing is almost as much fun, but it takes a lot of discipline. You just have to sit there and type for a long time. It's amazing how much you can cook if you really ought to be writing. And then the editing is not much fun, because you've got somebody telling you did it wrong when, you know, I'm a legal writing professor. I think I did it right. Thank you. You know, but no, apparently, you know, there are indeed flaws that an editor finds. And then the proofreading is the worst, because then you find major mistakes that got past everyone, but you can't change them without it actually costing you money, because it's already printed and in galley form. And then you wait a few months, and then the book comes out, and that's the big thrill. So, and by the way, it turns out that if it's not your first book, if it's your second book, they'll spot you a little bit more in royalties. So that's a small improvement too. But anyway, that's the story of how you can end up, you can start out like anybody else thinking you want to write a book someday, and then you can end up actually doing it. I would love to take your questions on anything, including, I don't know if you would even want to know what it's like to teach at law school. We could talk about any of that. Tomatoes, windsurfing, anything.
So windsurfing, Professor. I'm Charlie Telfair.
Hi.
Did you do windsurfing, the windsurfing regatta in Charlotte County? Do you remember that, Charlotte County, Florida? Were you involved?
I did not do that one. When I was marketing the windsurfers, I was based in Massachusetts, and I did organize one Florida regatta. It was in St. Pete Beach, and it was 2 weeks long. So imagine, from Massachusetts, I got to come back to Florida for 2 weeks in early winter. I didn't mind that at all. But that was the only Florida one I did until I moved to Fort Myers and was working for muscular dystrophy. And then I did a few around Fort Myers and Sanibel. But no, why, were you in the Charlotte County one?
Well, my father, it was run by General Development, and my father was the operations manager of General Development at that time. So he ran the windsurfing regatta. He planned it,
wow.
and ran it. So that's why I asked you that question.
Oh, yeah. You know, I grew up in a general development community. I grew up in Port Malabar.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yep, I did too.
yeah, I bet.
Did you, when were you at Holland and Knight?
I was only there for a little less than 3 years. I was there from 91 to 94.
Okay, we just missed each other.
91 was a summer associate thing. Yeah, I was in the Jacksonville office.
All right, I was in Tampa and Bradenton with Gilbert Smith, Judge Smith. So that was kind of cool.
Yeah, yeah. I loved the firm. Like so many people, you know, I loved them, they loved me, but I married this guy whose roots go 100 years back in Melrose, Florida, which is where I'm sitting right now in my 100-year-old house. So, you know, everything was great until I realized one day that, you know, he's really never going to be happy, really happy, unless he's back where he belongs. And so, you know, that was well worth it for me to give up Holland and Knight. And now I'm, you know, super happy teaching at the law school. So, so that's why I didn't stay very long. I couldn't get Holland and Knight to open a Gainesville office because Gainesville's not too far away from here. So, so I had to let that go. But it's nice to loop back a little bit now by doing the Chesterfield Smith book. I've gotten to interview a lot of Holland and Knight people who worked with him.
Mary, when you were down and talked to the Manatee County Bar Association, it was before the election and the constitutional revision. And we had, and a lot of us know the chairman who got appointed, Carlos Baruch.
Right, that's right.
And I know that you spoke many times down here through those months before the election with respect to what was going to happen. And so we know what happened. It was a little different than a lot of us thought was going to happen. I, as a judge, am happy because Amendment 6 got passed. But
Right.
But give us your insight since that time that you were down here, and Cliff Walters is online. Charlie Telfair was at the luncheon too, where you spoke before, but that was way before the election.
Yeah. Well, briefly, for those of you who weren't following along, and believe me, the state is full of people who have never heard of the Constitution revision and might not even be aware that it happens every 20 years and it happened just 2 years ago. It's okay if you don't remember because it's kind of, I mean, for me, it felt like it was all over the news, but I'm zoomed in on that. You know, it's kind of what my book was about. So, so it's okay. So briefly, our Constitution is the only one in the country that has an automatically recurring every 20 years Constitution Revision Commission with the power to put proposals directly on the ballot without going through the legislature. That's unique. Nobody else, no other state has ever had one of these other than Florida. The members are appointed. The governor appoints some, the Speaker of the House, President of the Senate, Chief Justice, all appoint people, and then the Attorney General is automatically a member. So these people meet, and they met for a little more than a year between 2017 and 2018. And their charge is to review the whole Constitution and determine what parts of it, if any, need amending, revising. And for that reason, they're not stuck with a single subject thing because they have the ability to revise the whole thing if they want. So no single subject requirement. So they met and they had some things that maybe not everyone would consider to be overarching general qualities of the shape of the fundamental governmental document for our state. For instance, no vaping, right? If y'all remember that, you know, what's that doing in the Constitution? Well, as a matter of fact, there was a reason, and the reason is that there's a no smoking here and there. I forget the parameters, but there's a no tobacco provision in the Constitution, and this commissioner, who actually is from this area, it's Lisa Carlton, you probably all know her. She wanted to prioritize putting vaping in there as well as a prohibition. And since smoking was in the Constitution, vaping belonged there. So she proposed that. A ban on oil drilling offshore. And somehow vaping and drilling got put in the same proposal. That wasn't a very popular idea, we thought. And then there were a lot of really detailed, specific things, and there were a lot of them. Almost every single one of them got challenged in court. That had never happened before for any Constitution Revision Commission. Whatever they did went straight to the ballot. Our Supreme Court actually knocked one of these things off the ballot for being misleading. So there were all these sort of, oh, let's end dog racing. Does that belong in the Constitution? So there are all these little specific things that a lot of people thought either they don't belong in the Constitution or they don't belong together on the same proposal, like vaping and drilling, or they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes about one thing or another. So there was a lot of opposition on the ground to a lot of these. Almost every newspaper editorial board in the state said either vote them all down or vote all but, a couple of them down. And so imagine everybody's amazement when every single one of them passed. Everything the Revision Commission proposed passed. They have to pass by more than 60%. Every one of them did. So it was really, I was emailing a few people going, congratulations, did you expect this? I didn't expect it. And they didn't, the CRC members didn't expect all of their things to win either. So that was, there might be people who have tried to actually parse out why, but I don't, if there are, I don't know about it. I guess people just kind of said, I want to see Gilbert Smith Jr. be able to stay in office until he's 75, so I'm going to vote yes. It was, but some of these things were paired with less popular things. The 75-year-old judicial retirement age. I'm hugely in favor of that, but they paired it with some things that I was not so much in favor with. And I have to confess to you, Judge Smith, that I voted no on that, even though I really wanted to vote yes on your part. So, so that was a wild ride. It was really a wild ride. And the whole felon voting amendment that passed as a citizens initiative, there were no less than 3 proposals within the Constitution Revision Commission that would also have provided the ability for felons to vote. And one of them was worded identically to the Citizens Initiative. Just in case the Citizens Initiative didn't pass, they were going to see if they could get it on the ballot their way. So there were a wide variety of types of things that this group came up with. And they didn't end up meeting very often. Mr. Baruth, as chair, didn't really believe in having a whole lot of meetings. And so the committees met on particular schedules, but the group as a whole, they almost never met as a whole until the very end when they had to decide what went on the ballot. So very interesting. And it was in high contrast to the other two, the 1978 and 1998 ones, who they met together as a whole for weeks at a time to get consensus on things. This group was very much more separated out. A few people told me, they almost never met the other members. If they didn't share committee duties with them, they just didn't even meet them. So anyway, that was a fun adventure.
I had a quick question.
Yes.
I was in the public school system for about 38 years, and I remember Mr. Turlington when he was working the schools to get the lottery stuff passed, and then I never heard anything more about him. And you said you interviewed him later on. Whatever happened to him? He
is still alive. He's 98. what happened was, I forget who told me. It might have actually been Senator Graham who told me how to get in touch with Ralph Turlington. He's in now I don't know what happened between education commissioner and retirement, but for several years, he's been in an assisted living home in Durham, North Carolina, which is where a daughter of his lives. And I tell you what, I interviewed him by phone in 2014. And he not only had every single one of his marbles, but he also was just enthusiastic, just laughing. I mean, happy to tell me stories. It was really heartening to interview him. But yeah, he's been retired for quite a while. He might be turning 100 this year. I forget whether he was born in 20 or 22, but it's been a while. I think he was born in 1920, the more I think about it. He might be turning 100 this year.
Thank you.
He, if you read my book, he was extremely smart, but he had a fairly cutting wit when he wanted to.
Can you tell us an interesting story from your book about Chesterfield Smith? Put you on the spot.
Yes, boy, there's almost nothing but interesting stories. Wow, you did put me on the spot. It's almost like there's too many.
Well, I'll tell you, I can tell you the interesting story.
Thank you. I was just going to ask for your help. Yeah, thanks.
A president of Kiwanis, Senator Ed Price, was our senator and an influence on Braden and Kiwanis for many, many years, maybe 40, 50 years. Maybe one of the most influential people in Southwest Florida and maybe the state of Florida at one time. His phone, the governor answered his phone for at least 40 years, whoever was the governor. And when Jimmy Carter was president, he got invited because he was a high executive with Tropicana and did a lot of international trade. He went to Washington, D.C., to the White House and with Chesterfield. And they are in the White House walking down to the Oval Office, and someone down the hallway yells, "Chesterfield." And Ed says to Chesterfield, "Who is that?" And Chesterfield says, "Wait just a minute." And so he walks up, and it's Brezhnev from Russia. So Senator Ed Price told me that story probably 30, 35 years ago. And there's so many interesting stories that traveling with Chesterfield that Ed had. But so there's so many presidents of this club who knew Chesterfield very well, including Ed Price, including Judge Hensley, and many others.
And here's a couple small ones. One about his career and one about his family.
And I gotta go, so.
Yeah, okay, bye-bye. One of Chesterfield's partners said that they were up in the Washington, D.C. office of Holland and Knight in the, I don't know, probably mid-90s, and they'd been in the office and they were going somewhere else. And they were standing on a street corner, and this guy tells me, he says, we're standing there waiting across the street, and this car comes up, and the back window rolls down, and I hear a woman's voice going, "Chesterfield, you need a ride?" And he looks, and it was Justice Ginsburg offering him a ride, and they were great friends. Another little story that I tell my friends when they say, is your story going to bore me? Does it have sex? Does it have car chases? And I say, well, it does have brief nudity, so I'll tell you that story. Chesterfield Smith's kind of big moment of fame came when he was the ABA, American Bar Association president, during Watergate. And he was one of the first sort of members of the establishment to speak out against the Saturday night massacre that happened during Watergate. And of course, he was getting a lot of support. He was also getting a whole lot of condemnation for his stance. And during this whole time, his son, who was college aged at the time, maybe 20 or so, got arrested in Lakeland for streaking. Remember streaking? And so he, he was streaking with the daughter of another high-ranking partner at Holiday Night. They both got arrested. And so his name being Chesterfield Smith Jr., it makes the international news. And one of the things that happened with that was that Chesterfield Smith, president of the ABA, gets interviewed about it and gets asked, what do you have to say? What do you have to say for your son? And he goes, well, I'm very sorry that he got caught. And then they said, well, do you think that he needs a lawyer? And Chesterfield said, hell no, he doesn't need a lawyer, he's guilty. So that was his take on the law as it applied to his family. And there were some other little ins and outs of that I'll let you read the book to find out. But yeah, he was a character. There were a lot of stories. Anita, can you think of any?
I just remember, not like that, but the dish he was famous for.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Everybody gathered, and that was a huge production all day long. And anyway, that was just something about him. People probably didn't realize that he liked to cook.
Yeah, he developed this dish. It was sort of a paella and sort of a
everything in it.
pilaf. Yeah. But it had a lot of shellfish in it. And I've had more than one former associate of his at Holland and Knight say, he didn't care if you were allergic to shellfish or if you were Jewish and didn't want to eat, it was against your religion to eat shellfish. He would pile it in your plate anyway, and it was up to you to pick through it. And I've made it a few times, and it's a wonderful dish.
It takes all day.
It does take all day. But yeah, and I think part of it, it was actually published in the Miami Herald in 1991. And I think part of that was, then in that day, it was unusual for a professional man to have any interest in cooking. And so, that was sort of newsworthy in itself. But it's actually a wonderful dish. So yeah, my fantasy is that I'll cook that for my book launch, but I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to have the will to spend all day on it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Those are great stories, and we
Thank you.
really appreciate you joining us today.
I appreciate you having me.
We our tradition is to give our speaker a golden ruler. That ruler is to help them measure their past and future success. And so we'll make sure you get one when this whole quarantine thing is over.
Well, thank
Really
you
enjoyed
so
having you
much.
today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
We appreciate the guests that joined us as well. And Christy has a word about next week's speaker. And Mac will finish us up.
So I'm sure most of you may or may not have noticed that we don't have a speaker on the schedule yet. So we're working on bringing a speaker next week. We're hoping that Xtavia Bailey has time in her schedule. But if not, Janine Amick and Xtavia are working on a project on town hall conversations to be had at the theater, covering topics in our community, doing it in a panel discussion type way on racism, on all the issues that are going on in our community right now, to start getting people to start talking about it. So I asked if both of them would come and talk to us just about where they're at in the plans for doing this, what it's going to look like, so we as a club and as club members can see that and figure out if any of you would want to get involved with them in helping. I'm sure that either of them would appreciate it. I know Susie Bowie's involved in it, and quite a few other groups are involved in it. We thought it would be nice for everyone to hear it before it comes out in full flare, so that you can have some input with them. And that's about all I know about it so far. And with that, Mac, do you want to close us out?
Well, yeah, I've got a couple things here. I just noticed Amy from the chamber has mentioned that they're continuing to provide masks to local businesses for employees. And it says at the last count, they were a little over 29,000 masks, almost 500 businesses. So anybody who's out there who is employing people and would like to get some masks, just contact somebody at the chamber. And she also mentions that the Leadership Manatee applications are due this coming Monday, July the 6th. It was a deadline earlier, but they were asked for some more time. So if you know of anybody, if you yourself are interested in getting involved in Leadership Manatee, great organization, and we've got a lot of members out of that particular group in the past. So that's something that I want to encourage you to do. I also want to encourage you that if you haven't been checking your newsletters, please do so. I've gotten some good comments over the last couple of days now since I sent out the latest newsletter. Even got one from a gentleman that we haven't seen in a while, Mr. Bodie. So that was kind of, I think it was Brody or Brody, forget. Anyway, it was very interesting to hear from them. There are links in there to some different videos. We do have a link to our YouTube channel. And I encourage you, really strongly encourage you to paste that into your browser someplace, subscribe to it. One of the nice things about it is once you subscribe, that rather than having to worry about receiving a link from an outside source, it should tell you when a new project has been uploaded. So it's good to do. And we also get some perks out of it after a while. And, seeing Brett there too with a Facebook page. If you have not signed up to become a member of our club's Facebook group, please, I encourage you to do that too, because Brett's done a great job getting stuff out there and making sure that we're well informed. So that's all I have. I'll turn it back over to Mike.
Thank you, Mac. And I appreciate everybody being here. If you can, next week, please try to join us. These are real important conversations that are being had throughout the community and throughout the country. And as Kiwanis, we need to be in the forefront. So please make every effort to be here. And thank you all for joining us. And with that, Mac, ring the bell.
Here we go.